Chapter 1. Grounded. The words had come out clinical, like a weather report, but they landed like an eviction notice in the dead of winter. You'll never fly again. Beckett didn't remember much else from that doctor's appointment. The accident hadn't even happened in the line of duty. It was a shallow break near Bellows Beach, bodyboarding, a short wave. He didn't even have time to throw his arms out. 8 feet down, head first into hard sand, falling without any control. Beckett had always thrived on maintaining total control. His neck twisted sideways with a sickening snap. He surfaced dazed, tumbled by the next wave. Lucky he hadn't drowned or been left paralyzed in the sand. After that, the strength never fully came back into his left hand. The doctor said it traced back to his neck, a pinched nerve, maybe worse, a quiet kind of theft. Enough to drive, enough to fake normal, but not enough to fly. Not enough to trust himself at 30,000 feet ever again. It had been a sterile room in a military clinic on Oahu, the windows bolted shut against salt air. The kind of place where bad news settled in your chest before you even heard it, just the way the fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the way the doctor didn't meet his eyes. That, and the sudden silence that followed. Not around him, inside, like something shut off, like someone had reached inside and stolen a part of him. It was months ago now, but the words still echoed in the spaces no one else could see. Jacob Beckett Pryor, but nobody called him Jacob anymore. Beckett had stuck somewhere between basic training and his first deployment, and he never corrected it. It felt safer, less personal, like the version of him that could still fly was still out there somewhere, waiting. Beckett still carried himself like someone trained to scan a room. Broad shoulders squared out of habit, eyes that held the weight of too many long nights mid-30s, with close-cut hair now flecked with early silver at the temples. His jaws stayed tight even when he wasn't speaking, and a faint scar trailed along the side of his neck, mostly hidden unless he turned just right. He wasn't built like a gym guy, more like someone who'd spent years lifting real weight for a living. His presence wasn't loud, but it lingered, like the echo of something once airborne that still hadn't fully come down. Beckett was from Squim, a quiet town farther up the peninsula, where mornings smelled like cedar and everything shut down by 8. The kind of place where people knew your truck, your parents, and your business, whether you liked it or not. He hadn't grown up here, in Tacoma. This place never felt like his. Not really. Now he lived near Swan Creek, back in Alicia's world, not his. There was a time he used to laugh without effort, dance with Alicia in the kitchen just to make the kids giggle. He used to leave notes in her books before deployment, sometimes verses, sometimes short poems or inside jokes, scribbled on napkins from Sherry's Diner, folded between the pages like pressed flowers. That man felt like someone else now, someone he still hoped she remembered. He'd met Alicia online in the mid-2000s, online dating site, one of the early ones. She was sweet, direct, and she'd never had a boyfriend before him, just a few bad blind dates in college that didn't go anywhere. They were married by the next summer. Alicia had the kind of beauty that didn't announce itself, almond-shaped eyes that seemed to notice more than she let on, and soft curls she rarely tried to style, usually pulled into a simple clip or bun. She wore long sleeves, even in spring, and always smelled faintly of bergamot and warm vanilla, like tea left steeping near an open window. Her smile didn't come easily anymore, but when it did, it felt like the kind of thing you'd remember years later, wondering what you did right to earn it. She grew up attending Elk Hill Baptist, a small church that still ran potlucks and patchy VBS programs. Her family had drifted away over the years, but Alicia stayed, quietly stubborn in the way only the faithful understand. It's where she'd always imagined raising her kids. She had studied early childhood development at a small private college outside Seattle, one known for its faith-based approach. At one point, she'd planned to be a missionary, but then came marriage, then military life. She never used that degree. Still, she became an incredible homeschool mom, rooted, patient, fiercely attentive. And maybe, Beckett sometimes thought, that counted for something more eternal than ministry credentials ever could. During Beckett's deployments, the kids, Florence, who was always called Flo, and Caleb, stayed rooted in their homeschooling rhythms. Now that Beckett was out of the military and grounded from flying permanently, Alicia had picked up a part-time job working at the local public library. Just enough to get out of the house, just enough to be tired. Deployment after deployment. They didn't fight. Not really. They deferred. They endured. And now, with nothing left to defer to, they didn't know what to do with the silence. Now they were stuck in the same house every day, learning who they actually were, and realizing maybe they didn't know. But being grounded wasn't the hardest part. It was coming home to a life that kept moving without him. The house creaked as he moved down the hallway. It was early Wednesday morning, quiet, but not the kind of quiet that invited rest. It pressed against the windows, thick and stale, like a room where too many prayers had gone unanswered. Alicia had already left for her part-time shift. The kids were still asleep in their rooms, tucked into the makeshift style of homeschool life Trixie padded behind him, clicking across the walnut floors with quiet loyalty. She was a Jack Russell mix they'd adopted in Hawaii. Submissive to a fault, she'd bonded to Beckett instantly, the kind of dog that melted onto your chest like gravity, eager to belong. He poured what passed for coffee, bitter, black and burnt, then stared out the window. The mist was thicker now, stretching past the yard, curling down the street like it had somewhere to be, like it was looking for someone else to find. Mist hovered over the backyard, like breath from something sleeping beneath the earth. For a heartbeat, Beckett thought he saw two faint sparks blinking in the mist, but when he blinked again, there was nothing. He didn't like the way it lingered. It clung to the glass like static, charged and restless. It reminded him of the air before a heavy airdrop aboard his C-17, a mission where the rear doors opened mid-air and supplies were kicked out by crew members strapped into harnesses, wearing parachutes in case something went wrong. Food, gear, ammunition, anything that could fall safely from the sky into war zones. The silence before the doors opened. That's the part that stayed with him. The wrong kind of stillness, where even the engines seemed to hesitate, waiting for something they couldn't outrun. Like creation itself was bracing for something it didn't want. That's what the mist felt like. He took a sip of the coffee and winced at the bitterness. It stayed on his tongue long after he swallowed, just like the silence in his chest. There was a time he would have greeted the day like an old friend, checked the wind, watched the sky. Now he watched for cracks, signs he was still slipping. He'd taken to journaling again, scribbles of scripture, disconnected thoughts, dreams he couldn't explain. They filled the margins of a notebook he kept hidden in the desk at home. Just knowing it was there helped. He dressed like he was heading into the field, boots laced tight, shirt clean, untucked, beard trimmed like he meant it. He told himself it helped him feel in control. Mostly it just made him feel separate. The tinnitus was always worse in the mornings, just enough to remind him of what used to be. A high, hollow tone, steady and meaningless. A hiss from the past that never let go. He drove to work in silence. Worship music made him guilty. News made him numb. Prayer felt like a language he'd forgotten. The only thing louder than the silence in his truck was the noise in his head. Beckett parked in the same spot every day, third from the end, beneath a dying maple tree that never bloomed fully in spring. He liked it that way. Trees weren't supposed to lie about what they'd been through. The office was a converted floor in an aging downtown building, dull tile, second-hand desks, and coffee that tasted like burnt hope. He moved through the entry like a ghost, nodding at Sue behind the front desk without expecting her to notice. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied a beat late, already looking at her screen. At the coffee machine, he asked, "Good weekend?" "Fine," she said, already distracted. "Still vertical," he muttered, and moved on. His cubicle was quiet, his inbox was full, and his head was already starting to pulse. The overhead lights buzzed like a headache made real. He powered on his computer and tried not to notice the way his hand shook a little when he reached for the mouse. It wasn't just the migraines. Some mornings, the shaking started before his coffee, before his inbox even loaded. Like his body knew something was wrong, even when he tried to pretend otherwise. Beckett stared at his inbox and moved his hands without thinking. Another mold complaint. Another broken water heater. Another voicemail flagged urgent and ignored by corporate. He typed, he forwarded, he filed. Most days, it felt like throwing letters into a fire. By lunch, the migraine was pressing behind his right eye. He ducked out early and sat in his truck, pulling up a video from his deployment days. The grainy clip showed a hard landing. Afghanistan, maybe. A dry riverbed, clouds of dust kicking up, that familiar tilt of the cockpit as the rear wheels made first contact. He remembered the feel of the yoke in his hand, the tension, the release. Now he just sat gripping a steering wheel, praying his hands would stop trembling. That night, Alicia reheated leftovers. Caleb asked him to bless the meal. Beckett hesitated, then did. It felt hollow, routine, the kind of prayer that sounded more like a voicemail than a conversation. After dinner, he helped Flo with her math homework while Trixie napped under the table. Caleb wandered over halfway through, chewing on a cheese stick and peering over her shoulder. "You got that one wrong," he said, matter of fact. Flo rolled her eyes. "I did not." "You forgot to carry the one." "I did not forget. I just hadn't written it yet." Beckett raised a hand gently. "Caleb, let her finish. Flo, check the carry. He might be right." Flo huffed dramatically, but a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Caleb looked smug, which lasted about 10 seconds before Flo shoved the paper toward him. "You do the next one, math boy." He took the pencil with exaggerated confidence and immediately froze. "Wait, which one is the divisor again?" Beckett laughed softly. "That's what I thought." Trixie snored under the table. Flo resumed humming, something improvised, barely melodic, but sweet and steady. She always sang when she felt safe. He watched them, the smallest echo of peace in his chest. Maybe this was what normal looked like. Perhaps this was the best version of it he could hope for right now. He wanted to reach for Alicia's hand, ask her if she was okay. But she was already up, clearing the table, moving past him like fog. The moment passed. It usually did. He lay awake for a long time after everyone had gone to bed. They felt more like roommates now, cordial but distant, bound more by habit than heat. He couldn't remember the last time they danced. He missed that most of all. The way she used to melt into him like her whole body remembered who they were. Trixie curled against his feet. Alicia faced the other way. He listened to the hum of the house, the fridge, the ticking wall clock, the slow groan of pipes. Then something else. Just under the noise, almost imperceptible, a pulse, like static, like breath through walls. He sat up, waited. Nothing. He laid back down, heart pounding harder than it should have been. That night, sleep came in pieces. Just after midnight, Beckett found himself paralyzed, chest tight, limbs like concrete, the air bleeding cold, peeling the warmth off the walls. His mouth tasted metallic, like rust and wilted flowers left too long in water. His mind screamed, but his body stayed locked. The hallway light oozed under the door like a wound. The room stretched unnaturally around him, distant and wrong. He could make out the dresser's shape, Alicia's silhouette beneath the blankets. But something else was there. It was standing at the foot of the bed. Not quite shadow, not quite smoke, not quite human. She moved like temptation, sharpening into thought. Her outline pulsed and blurred, unable to hold a single form for more than a heartbeat. It wasn't that she lacked form, it was that she didn't belong to one. Her shape shifted at the edges, flickering like a memory of fire through fog feminine in outline, but the details refused to settle, as if her presence was the echo of something old, layered in a way the human eye wasn't made to comprehend. She didn't move like a person. She moved like thought, like temptation. Female, yes, but wrong. Her presence radiated like a perfume of burning feathers and cold oil, clinging, invasive. The room pulsed with it. Her face hovered where light didn't fall. Eyes that weren't eyes, like rot blooming behind glass. Her mouth didn't move, but Beckett heard her anyway. Not with his ears, with his chest. Words like vines curling around his ribs. The blood still speaks for you, but not for long. Something in the room shifted, closer, darker, as if her claim was already true. "You are already mine." He tried to pray, tried to speak, tried to move. His limbs didn't just freeze. They strained against themselves as if puppet strings held him fast. His mind blurred at the edges. For a heartbeat, her face came into view, both beautiful and decaying, like something wearing beauty as a mask. And then, just as suddenly, she was gone. The tension didn't just vanish, it cracked. The room felt like it snapped at the seams. Beckett's body released with a jolt, limbs jerking like a swimmer breaching rotten water. Trixie growled low at the foot of the bed, her hackles raised. He didn't move, didn't speak. He knew what he'd felt, and he knew it hadn't come from inside him. Not long after, he dreamed of the runway again. But this time, he couldn't lift off. Something clung to the landing gear, and behind it, in the shadows, something watched with yellow eyes. The next morning, Beckett rose earlier than usual, the phantom of that presence still clinging like smoke. He stood in the hallway longer than necessary, watching the way morning light touched the edges of the living room. Alicia passed behind him with a travel mug in hand and a wordless nod. No questions, no kisses goodbye. The kids were still asleep, the house thick with that familiar silence that felt less like peace and more like distance. He went to the kitchen and scribbled in the margin of his notebook, something about the yellow eyes, about how the paralysis lifted right when he stopped fighting. He didn't write demonic, didn't write spirit, just tried to name the feeling. He hesitated, then flipped back to an older page, one from weeks ago. A prayer, scratched out and half-hearted, followed by a note in different ink. Sometimes I wonder if the others from the group still feel it, like I do. After a moment, he flipped back a few pages and found a prayer half-written. He stared at it for a long time, then closed the notebook again. By the time the kids woke, he'd refilled the dog's water bowl, started the dishwasher, and prepped breakfast the way they liked it. Beckett didn't want to sit still. Flo came in yawning, hoodie halfway over her head. Did we run out of peanut butter again? Beckett nodded. Used the last of it yesterday. She sighed and grabbed a banana. I dreamed about snakes again. Beckett paused. Big ones or little ones? Big and shiny, and one of them had your voice. He didn't answer. Caleb entered behind her, thumbing the analog stick of a controller that wasn't even on. I dreamed about space. I was alone, and the stars were fake. Trixie barked once at the door, like she wanted to chase something she couldn't see. Beckett poured himself another coffee and stared out at the thinning mist. Washington was rotting at the edges. He could feel it, like a sickness under the soil. Something old was clawing its way back into the world, not in the shadows of a city, in the silence of his own soul. Chapter 2, Caffeine Ghosts. Nick came back to Squim on a grey Thursday with nothing but a duffel bag, a sketchbook, a vague sense of failure, and a couple of books he couldn't quite explain keeping. One of them was his old high school yearbook. He hadn't opened it in years, but it had followed him from place to place like a splinter he couldn't dig out. He was thin, wiry, the kind of guy who looked like he'd either missed meals on purpose or forgotten them entirely. Tattoos curled up both arms, birds, broken clocks, thorny vines, and his clothes were black on black, from hoodie to jeans to boots. He wore rings and bracelets and a silver nose stud like armor, not flair. He moved like a guy who used to want to be noticed and didn't anymore. His duffel bag slumped in the passenger seat, half unzipped and spilling sketchbooks and scribbled receipts. Nick cracked the window, letting the misty air creep in, and slouched lower in the seat. His car, an older Honda Civic with peeling tint and a subwoofer he'd installed in high school for attention, sat on Main Street, tucked between a row of fading storefronts and a crooked lamppost. Main Street looked like it hadn't changed in 20 years. A pharmacy, a couple of gift shops with hand-painted signs, a second-hand bookstore that somehow still survived. Further down, a low brick building that used to be a dentist's office was now turned into a counseling center or something. He hadn't driven that far. Toward the corner, a worn coffee shop hunkered between the pharmacy and the bookstore. A hand-painted sign on the window showed a steaming mug cradled in a pair of wings, lavender sprigs twined around the handle, and two small eyes painted just above the rim, meant to look whimsical, but somehow they never sat quite right. The words Sacred Grounds swirled in faded script underneath. Nick stared at it for a moment. Still the same logo, still pretending the world hadn't moved on. For half a second, Nick had the ridiculous feeling that the painted eyes on the coffee cup were watching him. He blinked, shook it off, and pushed the thought away. The heat in the car had faded, the windows fogged softly at the edges. Squim hadn't changed much, still felt like a town where nothing happened, unless you counted farmers' markets and passive-aggressive city council disputes. It was best known for its lavender, fields of it blooming each summer, drawing tourists to the so-called lavender capital of North America. The annual festival in July brought visitors eager to stroll through the fragrant fields and pick their own bundles. But outside of lavender season, the town settled back into its quiet rhythm. Nick had left after graduation with every intention of never returning. Nick leaned back against the headrest, the old Civic ticking quietly as it cooled. The town hadn't changed, maybe he hadn't either. But after a breakup with his long-term girlfriend, who cheated on him, and losing his job, Portland didn't want him anymore. He didn't have the will to fight it, so now he sat there for another breath, bracing himself. Then he shoved open the door and climbed out, slinging his duffel bag over one shoulder. The chill of the air bit against his sleeves as he crossed the street. When he pushed the shop door open, the familiar jingle of a little brass bell overhead greeted him, a sound that hadn't changed either. The smell hit him as soon as he stepped inside, espresso and cinnamon, but now layered with something faintly herbal, floral, earthy, a hum under the usual shop noise like an intrusive whisper. The kind of smell you associate with yoga classes or handmade candles in mason jars. It clung under the warm scent of old coffee and worn wood, an afterthought that stayed too long. The space had shifted. The heavy tables were still there, but new tapestries draped the walls, printed with stars, moons, and a few psalm quotes rewritten to sound vaguely mystical. One faded verse, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart," was stenciled above the menu board, half obscured by a hanging fern. A narrow office stood tucked into the corner behind the main counter, its full glass front facing the cafe. Inside, a worn desk, battered chairs, and a window looking out toward the hills beyond town. Jeanette's name was painted on the door in looping, cheerful script. Jeanette Riker, proprietor. The space around it felt different somehow, still, as if whatever currents moved through the rest of the shop bent carefully around that door. Nick had forgotten how naturally Jeanette fit behind the counter. Back in high school, they'd both worked here, slinging burnt coffee and day-old muffins like it was some after-school rite of passage. Jeanette was just the manager then, running the place with a clipboard and a permanent smirk. A few years after he left Squim, she'd scraped together enough to buy it outright. Jeanette herself was already moving boxes behind the counter when he walked in. She wore layered scarves and a flowy top in earthy colors, one ear adorned with a feather earring, the other with a silver cross. Her hair, somewhere between silver and intentional lavender, twisted into a loose bun that always seemed to defy gravity. Her makeup shimmered faintly under the shop lights, like she was halfway to becoming something elemental. She looked up and smiled. A real smile, the kind that didn't ask questions yet. "You look taller," she said, eyeing his boots. "I'm wearing thicker soles," Nick replied, dropping his bag behind the register. "Still sarcastic?" He offered a dry shrug. "Still here." She gave him a lopsided hug and handed him the old staff manual, now updated with new age policies and a few glaring contradictions. Nick skimmed it and didn't comment. "Don't flirt with customers. Don't mock the oils. Don't touch the playlist." "Even the one with the whale sounds?" "Especially the one with the whale sounds." 20 minutes later, Grace pushed through the door and immediately fumbled with the handle, nearly dropping her tote bag in the process. Nick looked up automatically. He almost didn't recognize her at first. Her dark brown hair was longer now, curled softly around her face in a way that made her look both older and exactly the same. She wore a cardigan, of course, with a tiny enamel pin, a fox reading a book, the words "Read 'em and weep" tucked under the cartoon tail. Her tote bag was stuffed awkwardly with papers and what looked suspiciously like a stuffed animal peeking out from under a folder. No makeup, didn't need it. Her skin had the effortless glow of someone who forgot to be vain and somehow won anyway. Grace glanced up and spotted him, and the smile that broke across her face was so immediate, so awkwardly delighted, that Nick felt like someone had just punched him lightly in the chest. "Nick Dawson," she blurted, stepping forward too fast, lightly bumping into a coat rack near the door. Nick caught the coat rack before it toppled, steadying it with one hand. "Still the most graceful person in Squim, I see," he said, smirking. Grace flushed, laughing under her breath. Some things never change. They'd been in the same grade, floated through the same awkward assemblies and school projects, always aware of each other without ever being exactly close. "Are you staying busy these days?" Nick asked, brushing a hand back through his hair. "Busy enough," Grace said, tucking a loose curl behind her ear. "Still working at the counseling center down the street. Mostly teens, mostly chaos." She shifted her tote higher on her shoulder. "You?" Nick shrugged, trying to stay out of trouble, mostly failing. She laughed, the sound a little too bright, a little too real. "You always were good at that." For a second, they just stood there, the old familiarity pulling tight between them. Not uncomfortable, but not easy either. "You still drink the dangerous stuff?" she asked, nodding toward the register. If it still tastes like battery acid and regret, yeah. Grace pointed dramatically at him and called toward the counter. One wrath of the lamb for the guy who still thinks burnt coffee is a personality trait. She hesitated. Unless you want something milder, they've added flower teas now. Lavender blossom something. Nick made a face. I'll risk the regret. She laughed again and dropped into the seat across from him, like no time had passed at all. Nick slid into the chair across from her, setting his coffee down between them. They talked a little more. Nothing important, just scraps of old memories and awkward jokes, until Grace glanced down at her phone and winced. I should probably get back, she said, grabbing her bag. First session's already texting me memes about trauma. She stood, smiling a little too brightly. Catch you later, Nick. Yeah, he said, voice a little rougher than he intended. The door jingled as she disappeared back into the grey morning. Nick sat back, letting the bitterness bite the inside of his cheek. Outside, the sky was the colour of wet concrete. Inside, sacred grounds hummed with a low, restless energy. He pulled out his phone, thumbed through old notifications without really reading them. One voicemail blinked back at him, weeks old, unplayed. He tapped it on reflex. Sarah's voice came through, soft and hesitant, younger somehow. Hey, big bro. It's me. I heard you were back. Don't ask how, just small town, you know? I'm still dealing with the same stuff. Just wanted you to know I think about you sometimes. That's all. The message ended with a soft click. Nick stared at the phone for a long minute, the steam from his coffee twisting upward in a thin, tired spiral. He didn't delete it. He just let it sit there, glowing.